I recently watched a video from right-wing YouTube guy Sargon of Akkad, aka Carl Benjamin, that I found really interesting. And it left me with this uncontrollable urge to talk about it and really try to dissect the topics that it engages with. So that's what we're doing right now. The video is called The Death of the Orc, and in it, he opines on the tabletop game company Wizards of the Coast choice to not include orcs in their new edition of the Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual. This decision offends Sargon, who views it as an egregious example of so-called woke morality infesting Dungeons & Dragons and other works of fantasy fiction. Woke morality, as he defines it, being predicated on three main assumptions: that consciousness is self-determining, that morality is a rational construct, and that all rational actors are by and large the same. Skipping past any arguments I could make about whether or not these are accurate assessments of the woke worldview, or whether or not the woke worldview is something that can even be coherently defined, Sargon presents the orc as it has classically existed in fantasy literature, as something that is deeply problematic within this framework. Orcs are intrinsically biologically evil. It is written in their DNA, and it is thus rational, necessary even, to be racist against them. This is antithetical to the quote-unquote woke view that all people, all sapient creatures capable of speech and rational thought, are equal. Thus, the PC woke activists who run Wizards of the Coast had to change them. This is, in my opinion, kind of ridiculous for a few reasons. First of all, this conversation isn't new. In fact, it's about as old as the orc itself. J.R.R. Tolkien, the father of modern fantasy, who created orcs as we know them today, discussed on several occasions a moral issue he came to feel with his portrayal of them both as inherently evil monsters and as intelligent beings capable of speech. This would imply that they possess personhood, or in his worldview as a devout Catholic, souls, and were thus worthy of moral consideration. In other words, the exact line of reasoning Sargon derisively points to as to why woke rationalists are ruining fantasy storytelling is one that was espoused by the inventor of modern fantasy storytelling. The second problem I have with Sargon's claim is one that is revealed in his own arguments that he goes on to make. Because not long after he makes his argument about why woke hates orcs, he dismisses and lambasts the idea that the traditional portrayal of orcs as bloodthirsty savages could bring to mind any offensive stereotypes about real-world groups of people.
When looking at the orc, the progressive outrageously decides that orcs are actually a fantasy representation of black people. Much to the shock of literally everyone, they proceeded to eradicate the traditional concept of the orc on the grounds that everyone else was a racist. Normal people think that humans of all kinds are represented in Dungeons & Dragons by other humans, in every case. Orcs are monsters and are not representative of any humans.
So, Carl, if humans in Dungeons & Dragons are only represented through other humans, then what's the problem? Why does the orc destroy the lib worldview? The philosophical viewpoint that ties moral worth to consciousness and rationality is based on how those things actually work in the real world, where there are no races of biologically evil humanoids. Evil is not part of biology. It does not exist outside of our imaginations. It's not a tangible, measurable force the way it is in D&D lore. So if orcs really don't represent humans or anything else in the real world, then what exactly does this made-up fiction refute? Let's take a closer look at this conversation about orcs and racism. It seems like a rather easy slam dunk, doesn't it? I understand the temptation to look at this claim that orcs are a racist stereotype and say, wow, you think black people are like this? That's crazy, they're just orcs. I think you might be projecting your own racism a bit there, bud. Just saying. Checkmate, libcuck. But let's try to approach this in better faith. I want to replay something that Sargon said.
Humans of all kinds are represented in Dungeons & Dragons by other humans.
Is that true? Are humans in D&D and other fantasy worlds truly only represented by the literal human characters? Well, to me, the answer is no. Obviously not. Orcs and other fictional sapient beings are very clearly reflective of the humans that invented them, of how they view themselves and other humans. What is fantasy? What is mythology, if not a reflection of the human experience? Where else could it even come from? Tolkien knew this, and he made no effort to hide it. He spoke at great length about how he drew inspiration from his studies of linguistics, history, and the world's cultures, as he was creating the world of Middle-earth and the many different societies and races that lived in it. One of the most widely discussed examples is how the dwarves borrow many motifs in their history, language, and culture from those of Jewish people, and how different aspects of this can be read as both positive representation and as reinforcing certain unfortunate negative stereotypes. Likewise, the hobbits of the Shire clearly invoke an idyllic portrayal of the English countryside, the elves can be read as reflecting our reverence of ancient peoples, and the orcs are an example of how people throughout the history of civilization have conceptualized the barbarian. Unthinking, unrefined, violent brutes who possess an intrinsically lower moral and spiritual character than the civilized. This is how the ancient Greeks and Romans viewed the Celtic and Germanic tribes on their periphery, how their contemporaries in China viewed the peoples on their periphery, how the feudal Japanese viewed the Ainu and Emishi, and later the Europeans, how medieval Christians viewed non-Christians, how the European colonial empires viewed the peoples whose land they had conquered, and yes, how many white people in America have viewed people of African descent throughout the country's history. This does not mean orcs are a racist caricature of black people or of any other group, but to act like these portrayals of fictional races do not in part reflect our perceptions of humans in the real world is stupid and wrong, and Sargon knows this. Otherwise, he wouldn't point to the orc as something antithetical to the woke worldview. He wouldn't decry how the new woke orcs reject biological essentialism if he did not seek to defend the idea of biological essentialism in the real world. The thesis of Sargon's video is built on two contradictory points: that the orc is both not a portrayal of humanity or of any real-world human group, and that the orc reflects how the progressive, rationalist view of human nature is wrong. I want to be clear that I don't have a problem if you're not down with how orcs are portrayed in the new D&D. There is nothing wrong with you if you look at this illustration of a group of orcs vibing out with their bussin' zoomer haircuts and say, "This is kinda cringe," and GL. The artwork and flavor text here are just suggestions, and you can continue to run and play your game however you want. Personally, I have not and have no plans to buy the new Player's Handbook or Monster Manual, because it just doesn't seem like a worthwhile purchase to me, and I don't care to support Wizards of the Coast or their business practices. And frankly, all the politically correct changes that have been made such a big deal out of by certain people online just feel to me like the bog standard, cynical, faux progressive corporate virtue signaling that we're so used to seeing, or at least were so used to seeing, and that most people on the left, at least in my experience, don't really care about. I also don't think it's inherently wrong or problematic to portray fictional races as monstrous, or fundamentally different from humanity. There are many examples of fictional stories that use these tropes in a nuanced and interesting way. I'm also not against any possible criticisms of political correctness in modern storytelling. I think the idea that we should purge all examples of prejudice from fictional worlds is a bad one. Racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry exist in the real world. Portraying them in fictional worlds is interesting. And storytellers that try to wash their hands of such things and create perfect, prejudice-free utopias, well, you can do that if you want to, but usually I don't find that particularly compelling. That's just my preference, though. What I'm arguing against is this idea that this simplistic, reductionist portrayal of fictional races as inherently evil savages, end of story, is something sacred that ought to be preserved, and that portraying fictional races in a way that reflects the complex and multidimensional nature of real-world humans represents some kind of attack on Western storytelling tradition or whatever. Towards the end of Carl's video, he makes a point about heroism.
The problem of homogenizing the orc and reducing him to a mere human type is that no longer is there a conflict of moral visions. If we recall the previous edition's view of the orc, we see that they are biologically and spiritually driven towards conquest and invasion. This is a moral outlook which is not only completely incompatible with our own, but would destroy us entirely if it were not confronted with force. All heroism is in some way qualified by the knowledge that the issue cannot actually be talked out.
To him, the heroic fantasy of Dungeons & Dragons relies upon the existence of the orc, to the existence of an intrinsically evil subhuman threat, and the simple and morally uncomplicated mission to defeat this threat with violence. And I have to ask, why? There is only one race of sapient beings that exists in the real world. And, we're not inherently evil. We don't have morality in our blood. Yet we still have a concept of heroism and villainy. People who we call evil do not exist simply for the sake of badness. They exist for very complex reasons that are deeply tied to human nature, or more broadly, the nature of sentient life. This does not mean you can't recognize evil. This does not mean you can't condemn evil. This does not mean you can't hate evil. But it makes the problem of confronting evil much more difficult. And storytelling that deals with that is, in my opinion anyway, much more interesting. Tolkien never resolved his moral dilemma. He passed away in 1973 at the age of 81, leaving behind many unfinished writings. And we can only imagine what he might have done if he were able to continue. I think that's a tragedy. I think a story that explores the moral ambiguity of Tolkien's orcs, and perhaps humanizes them in a way we hadn't seen before, would be fascinating. But not for our friend Carl. To him, and those like him, dealing with a moral issue with the sort of complexity and nuance that is required in the real world is a no-no. He can't handle anything more complex than me good, you bad, me kill you now. Anything more might require him to question some of his assumptions. It might require him to look at things with a more critical eye. It might require him to think. I believe that Genghis Khan was a horrifically evil man. He ravaged civilizations, committed unspeakable atrocities, and left behind a trail of millions of corpses. But he was human. He did the things he did for human reasons, and every human has the capacity to do just as evil things, just as they have the capacity to do good things. To deny Genghis Khan his humanity, to separate him from the rest of the species, to reduce him to a mindless, slobbering green monster that is biologically predisposed to commit the atrocities he did, is dishonest, unrealistic, and boring.